They found me in the dim light of the stables on the night my life was supposed to be sealed to another family. Inside the house, 200 polished guests spun across the marble floors, oblivious to anything that didn't glitter or gossip. My father was likely raising a glass to celebrate the grand union he'd arranged, while my mother fainted with theatrical timing in front of whomever would catch her. But I heard none of it. I was kneeling beside our prized mare as she labored through a dangerous birth, my silk sleeves pushed past my elbows, my hands sunk into blood and warmth and fear. The stable smelled of straw and sweat and desperation. The mare's cries drowned out the distant music, and the foals inside her fought for their lives with each contraction. When the gossip finally spilled outdoors and whispers led the entire ballroom to the stable doors, I was too focused on saving the mare to notice that my family's carefully curated world was coming apart behind me. The mare's eyes had that frantic blaze animals get when they understand danger, but not its cause. Her sides rippled with effort, her breath sharp and uneven. Stable hands had already declared the situation hopeless and stepped away, muttering that nature had decided her fate. The veterinarian was miles off attending another emergency. I refused to accept their surrender. I had grown up with this mare, fed her apples in secret before dawn, brushed her coat until it glowed like polished metal. Losing her was unthinkable, so I ruined the Paris gown my mother had worshipped, the gown meant to charm a senator's family, and reached inside the laboring mare. My hands, trained for piano keys and embroidery needles, worked with a certainty I didn't know I possessed. When I felt the first foal's misaligned limbs, I guided them gently into place, my breath matching the mare's desperate rhythm. And when that foal finally slipped into the world, trembling and alive, a warmth surged through me that no ballroom applause could ever imitate. That was the moment my father appeared in the doorway, framed by guests who had followed him like wolves seeking spectacle. His face blazed a dangerous purple, his riding crop clenched so tightly the leather creaked. The guests behind him were wide-eyed with delight at the scandal unfolding. Nothing thrilled society more than the stumble of one of its own. I cradled the newborn foal to my chest, still kneeling in straw and ruin, when he spoke my name in a voice sharpened by humiliation. He listed every offense as though reciting a ledger. The senator's son had stormed out. Guests were outraged. My mother had collapsed into someone's arms, and here I was, sullying my birthright among animals. But I felt no shame. I told him the mare would have died if I had not stepped in, that his trained workers had surrendered while I refused to. My words, fueled by years of silenced thoughts, spilled out with reckless honesty. Horses, I said, had more truth and loyalty than the people who pretended to adore us while praying for our downfall. The silence after my outburst felt heavier than any blow he could have delivered. Guests inhaled scandal like perfume. My father's rage turned cold, far more dangerous than fury. With a quiet command, he banished me from his sight, dismissing me as though I were some stain on the household. I rose with the foal, still nestled against me, and walked through the parted crowd, past false tears, past servants too afraid to meet my eyes, past musicians who had abandoned their waltz to witness the fall of a daughter. I placed the foal beside its exhausted mother, ensured both were safe, and only then allowed the enormity of what I'd done to settle in my bones. I had shattered the engagement he'd arranged. I had humiliated my family in the most public way possible. And yet, beneath all the consequences waiting to descend upon me, I felt something my upbringing had never offered. Relief. Pure, unrestrained relief, like the first breath after being submerged too long. Morning came with a cold clarity that felt almost ceremonial. I was summoned to my father's study, still wearing the ruined silk dress I had slept in, its fabric stiff with dried blood and straw. I had spent the night curled in a corner of the stable, rising every few hours to check on the mare and her newborns. The scent of hay lingered on my skin, a quiet reminder of where I truly belonged. When I entered the study, my father did not offer a greeting. He stood rigidly behind his desk, hands clasped behind him like a judge preparing a sentence. Without preamble, he declared that I had chosen my station, that if I insisted on acting like someone who lived among animals, then I would be treated accordingly. He stripped me of access to the house, family meals, social expectations, even the privileges of bearing his name. My new life, he said, would be under the command of Silas, the head groom, a man known for breaking both horses and workers with relentless discipline. To my own surprise, fear didn't rise inside me. Instead, something close to liberation flickered. My father expected begging, tears, repentance, tools he was accustomed to wielding, but I simply nodded. If working in the stables was punishment in his mind, he had never understood me at all. He dismissed me with a gesture, as though erasing me from the household ledger. Moments later, I stood at the threshold of the stable-yard with a single bag of belongings and no promise of welcome. Silas waited for me like a stone statue carved by weather and hard years. He was tall, his skin dark as worn walnut, his eyes unreadable beneath heavy brows. Scars traced the backs of his hands, evidence of a life spent confronting animals far larger and more dangerous than himself. He looked at me without surprise, as though he had expected this outcome long before I had. With a voice like gravel slowly settling, he informed me that he'd been ordered to make me useful, to grind down whatever defiant spirit I carried. He pushed a pitchfork into my hands and pointed to a stall thick with muck. That was the first task in a line of endless ones. The work was more punishing than anything my upbringing had prepared me for. Within an hour, blisters blossomed across my palms, my fingers trembling from the foreign weight of actual labor. The air was thick with ammonia, burning my eyes and throat. My back protested every bend. My arms felt carved from stone. Yet each time I considered pausing, the idea of returning to the house, a gilded prison, kept me moving. Stall after stall, bucket after bucket, I worked until my muscles screamed and my dress clung to me in tatters. The stable hands watched from a cautious distance. Some resented me, convinced I'd been given a privileged path into their world. Others simply observed in silence, unwilling to risk involvement. Only one, a quiet young man named Jacob, offered the occasional sympathetic glance, though he never dared speak it aloud. It took 3 brutal days to clean every stall. By the time I finished, my hands were raw and my body felt stitched together with exhaustion. Silas approached me without expression, studying me with a long, deliberate silence. When he finally spoke, it was with the smallest nod of acknowledgement. I had endured what many would have abandoned within hours, and so the true lessons began. Silas's teaching was not gentle, but it was wise. He corrected my grip on tools, adjusted my posture, pointed out dangers I had never noticed. His words were few, but each held weight. Through him, I learned that horses communicate in subtleties, the flick of an ear, the shift of weight, the tension in a jaw. I watched him calm a trembling yearling with nothing more than steady breath and patient presence. His methods felt like a quiet rebellion against the violence my father considered normal. "A horse mirrors you," he told me once. "If you bring fear, it fears. If you bring anger, it fights. But come with patience, and it will give you its whole heart." Weeks passed, and Silas's lessons wove themselves into my hands, my movements, my instincts. The other workers, once wary, grew accustomed to my presence. Some even began offering quiet advice in passing, though none openly challenged Silas's authority. I learned to read a horse like a shifting landscape, the tremor in a flank, the angle of a tail, the tension at the corner of an eye. Silas showed me how to trim a hoof with precision, how to detect the earliest signs of lameness, how to soothe a horse through storms or sickness. His knowledge ran deeper than books or formal training. It came from lineage, from stories carried across oceans, from a father who had once trained desert horses that ran like wind over endless dunes. When Silas spoke of those creatures, his voice softened, as if memory alone could lift him from the chains of his present. Through him, I discovered a world far larger than the plantation that confined us both, a world where horsemanship was an art, not a contest of dominance. But whatever peace I was building within the stables did not extend to my father. He visited often, parading wealthy guests through the aisles as though the horses were trophies displayed for admiration. He ignored me entirely, though his silence felt heavier than confrontation. One afternoon he arrived with a group of influential men, all boasting opinions about training and breeding. They asked about the methods used on the estate, expecting to hear of strict discipline and firm control. My father obliged, speaking proudly of whips, pressure, and dominance. Something inside me snapped. I stepped forward, unable to let such arrogance stand unchallenged. I told them there were gentler ways, more effective ways, methods Silas used that didn't destroy a horse's trust. The silence that fell was sharp as broken glass. Heads turned. My father's eyes darkened. The guests watched eagerly. Scandal was more intoxicating to them than brandy. When I dared suggest that Silas's methods surpassed my father's own, I crossed a boundary I could never retreat from. The slap came with no warning. A flash of heat across my cheek, a metallic taste of blood blooming where my teeth cut my lip. The stable froze. Even the horses seemed to sense the shock that shuddered through the air. Before my father could strike again, Silas stepped forward, placing himself between us with calm, immovable certainty. He offered no threat, no raised voice, just the sheer presence of a man who had survived too much to be cowed by cruelty. My father hesitated, calculating the cost of punishing the trainer upon whom his prized horses depended. His friends watched with avid curiosity, delighted by the unfolding drama. Silas's voice was steady as he reminded my father that an injured worker, even one as lowly as me, was no use in the stables. The tension between them stretched thin, then snapped as my father withdrew his hand, though the fury in his eyes promised consequences yet to come. When he left, the air felt lighter, though my cheek still burned. Silas didn't comment, but something unspoken shifted between us. Trouble arrived the next morning in the form of a towering black stallion brought to the yard by my father himself. The creature was magnificent, muscle layered upon muscle, a coat dark as obsidian, eyes bright with fury and fear. He fought the ropes binding him, rearing with explosive power, screaming in a way that chilled even the seasoned workers. My father declared the stallion's name, Shadowfire, though everyone quickly began calling him Phantom. The horse had beaten every trainer he'd encountered, injuring some and terrifying others. The breeder had branded him unbreakable. That word alone seemed to excite my father. He announced that Silas had 2 weeks to tame the stallion or be sold to a brutal cotton plantation where his skills would rot under the sun. Silas listened quietly, though his jaw tightened. As my father walked away, pride swelling in his stride, I felt a cold dread settle in me. Phantom was not merely wild, he was wounded deeply by human cruelty. And now Silas's life, and perhaps mine, hung on whether trust could be rebuilt from the ashes of past harm. From the moment Phantom stepped onto the property, it was clear he carried more than wildness. He carried memory. He lunged at anyone who neared, his ears pinned flat, whites of his eyes showing like flashes of stormlight. Silas studied him with a quiet sorrow, recognizing signs of brutal mishandling, the tense muscles along his spine, the scars across his flanks, the deep-rooted mistrust that radiated from every movement. Instead of attempting to dominate him as my father expected, Silas began with stillness. He sat outside the stall for long stretches, speaking in soft tones, letting Phantom grow accustomed to the presence of a human who made no demands. It was slow work, painfully slow, and though progress showed in tiny increments, a moment of stillness, a quieted breath, my father grew increasingly impatient. The deadline he'd set for Silas hung like a blade above us both. Each day, Silas worked until exhaustion dulled his steps, and still Phantom kept his distance, fierce and trembling, a creature sculpted by cruelty. Then disaster struck with a recklessness born of desperation. A young stable hand named Thomas, eager to impress my father and perhaps earn favor, slipped into Phantom's stall with a bridle while Silas was away. His courage lasted only a heartbeat. Phantom exploded upward in terror, hooves crashing down with devastating force. Thomas's scream tore through the stables. Instinct overpowered thought as I rushed in, grabbing the nearest bucket and shouting to break Phantom's panic. Water clattered onto the ground, the noise startling enough to halt the stallion's next strike. Without hesitation, I stepped between the trembling boy and the enraged horse, spreading my arms as though my body could shield him from a beast twice my size. Phantom trembled, muscles rippling under his dark coat, eyes wild with the memory of every hand that had hurt him. I spoke softly, voice low and steady, not pleading, but promising, telling him I would not harm him, telling him he was safe. Words alone should not have worked, yet something in him listened. He lowered his head inch by inch until his breath warmed my open palm. The others watched in stunned silence as I touched his muzzle with slow, deliberate care. Phantom shuddered, but did not retreat. In that fragile moment, a bridge formed, uncertain, trembling, but real. Silas arrived just in time to witness it, his expression unreadable, but his eyes filled with something close to awe. My father, however, reached a very different conclusion. Upon hearing that Phantom had injured Tomas, he declared the stallion a danger and announced his intention to have the horse destroyed before nightfall. Panic surged through me. I stepped forward without thinking, insisting Phantom wasn't vicious, only frightened, only reacting to harm he didn't understand. I begged for a chance. 2 weeks to prove Phantom could be trained. My father scoffed until I appealed to the one power he valued, reputation. If I succeeded, he'd have a legend on his hands. If I failed, he'd enjoy the satisfaction of watching me fold. He agreed, but with terms meant to break me. If Phantom wasn't ready by the end of the 2 weeks, I would marry the widower he had chosen. Twice my age, father of 5, a man seeking a caretaker more than a wife. I accepted without hesitation because Phantom's life mattered more than my own future, and because every piece of me rebelled against returning to that suffocating world. Silas pulled me aside after the agreement, warning me I didn't grasp the enormity of the risk. Yet he didn't argue further. Instead, he smiled, softly, briefly, the first true smile I had ever seen from him, and said, "Then we begin tonight." And so we did. Under lantern light, while the plantation slept, we sat with Phantom hour after hour, building trust grain by grain. I told him my fears, my childhood, my longing for a life beyond lace curtains and whispered expectations. Silas shared stories of desert horses that followed their trainers like shadows, horses raised with kindness rather than terror. Gradually, Phantom leaned toward our voices. Gradually, the tremor in him quieted. By the end of the first week, Phantom was no longer the creature who had tried to tear down his stall in panic. He still watched every movement with caution, but he had begun to seek our presence, lowering his head when we approached, allowing us to brush along his neck and back. Saddling him was a delicate ritual, slow, patient, punctuated by long pauses whenever fear tightened his muscles. When I finally climbed onto his back, Silas stood close, ready to intervene if Phantom reverted to old terror. But the stallion only trembled, then settled, recognizing the weight of someone who meant no harm. We trained at dawn, then again at dusk, building rhythm, trust, and speed. Phantom's strides grew longer, smoother, powerful enough to feel like flight. My father watched from afar, pretending indifference while calculating outcomes in silence. As the race approached, whispers spread across the county, a disgraced daughter preparing an unbreakable stallion for a competition against Virginia's finest. And while the world speculated, Phantom and I simply learned each other. The night before the race, sleep refused to come. Every choice I had made converged on what tomorrow held: freedom or confinement, dignity or surrender. I crept down to Phantom's stall, where he stood awake, ears rotating gently, as if waiting for me. I pressed my forehead to his warm neck, letting his steady breath calm the storm inside me. "Tomorrow," I whispered, "we prove who we are." His soft nicker felt like an answer. By morning, the track was crowded with spectators hungry for gossip and victory. My father basked among them, confident his champion horse, Tempest, would maintain the family's legacy of triumph. He had not even bothered to look in my direction. As I led Phantom to the starting line, riders sneered, muttering about a woman racing in men's territory, about foolish pride, about spectacle. Their words slid off me like dust. Phantom's muscles thrummed beneath me, coiled with anticipation, not fear. When the signal cracked through the air, he surged forward with a force that stole my breath. The world blurred into wind and thunder beneath Phantom's hooves. We passed horse after horse before the first bend, the crowd's disbelief morphing into a rising roar. Phantom ran not to escape, not because he was driven by pain, but because he loved it, because running at last meant freedom. I leaned low, my body matching his rhythm, whispering small encouragements he didn't need but I wanted him to hear. Behind us, I could sense the frustration of other riders, the crack of whips urging exhausted animals forward. Phantom didn't need force. He had trust, and trust made him unstoppable. As we rounded the final stretch, I glanced back and saw Tempest fading, his strides faltering under the weight of harsh training and fear-driven obedience. Phantom, by contrast, surged ahead with fresh strength, ears pricked, breaths steady. We crossed the finish line 3 lengths ahead, and a hush fell over the crowd before erupting into astonishment. I slowed Phantom to a smooth canter, my heart pounding with triumph, not just for the race, but for the path we had carved together. My father stood stiffly as I dismounted, his expression contorted between outrage and something like reluctant awe. When he summoned me aside, the crowd watched eagerly, hoping for a spectacle. He accused me of humiliating him, of undermining his authority before the entire county. I told him plainly that I had proven his methods flawed, that Phantom's victory belonged to the kindness he resented. The fight drained from him then, leaving weariness in its place. With clipped words, he granted me what our bargain required, my freedom to choose my own life. But he also revoked our bond as father and daughter. The girl I raised, he said, ceased to exist the night she chose animals over her family. I felt no shock, no sorrow, only the steady certainty that I had finally stepped into the life meant for me. From that day forward, I remained in the stables as a trainer, not a daughter. People traveled from across states, seeking help with horses deemed dangerous or hopeless. Phantom became a legend on the racing circuit, undefeated for years. As time flowed forward, the plantation's hierarchy changed around us, but the partnership between Silas and me endured. He continued teaching me long after I gained a reputation of my own, his wisdom shaping not just my skills but my character. I tried repeatedly to buy his freedom, offering sums that would have emptied my savings, but my father refused every attempt, gripping the last chain he held over me. Silas lived and died on the estate, but his spirit was never broken. He left behind a lineage of training methods and stories that shaped generations. Phantom retired after a brilliant career, living out his days in comfort, and I buried him with a marker honoring his unbreakable soul. When my father passed, I did not attend the funeral. Instead, I remained in the stables, brushing down a young colt who would one day learn the same lessons Phantom had taught me. By the time I died, I had trained countless horses and students, leaving behind a legacy built not on obedience but on understanding. If history forgets my name, that is fine, because every horse trained with gentleness carries the truth of who I became.